All right, happy Friday, everyone. So today we're hopefully going to finish the last portion of our memory chapter. So we're going to start by talking about remembering lists, because we've spent so much time talking about the best way to remember lists. Why not keep at it? And so this is because, as I've said, lots and lots of psychology, especially when we're testing memory, they focus on giving people a list of words and seeing how they can manipulate the situation so that people remember more or less of the words on that list. And out of all of this research, all of this study of lists, they actually found something that seems to be fairly consistent across multiple situations. And we call this the serial position effect. And this describes the relationship between a word's position in a list and its probability of recall. And we see sort of two distinctive portions of this effect. The first is the primacy effect, and it tells us that it's a lot easier to remember things at the beginning of a list than it is to remember things at the end of the list. Or I guess it's just easier to remember things at the beginning than things that come after. But then we also have a second effect, and this is the recency effect, where we do very well at remembering things that we've encountered most recently. So the very, very end of the list also seems to be well remembered. And so if we kind of put this together, we would see that, okay, so we do really well at the first couple of items, and we do fairly well at the last couple of items, and then everything in between is very poor. So we tend not to remember stuff in the middle. So we have this nice U-shaped distribution. And some of the theories to try and explain what's going on here are based on the fact that this is maybe showing us that transition from things being in our immediate memory, things that we have available to us short term, and things that have been transferred over into long-term memory, having been encoded for storage later. So the idea here would be that the earlier items, the ones we saw first, might have started that process of encoding and are therefore more securely stored. Whereas the most recent ones, those might actually still be in our immediate memory. We might still have access to them in that sort of short-term recall that we have. And so if that's what we think is going on, there's probably a pretty easy way to see what happens. What if we wait long enough for our short-term memory to go away? What if we don't allow them to rehearse and we see what happens to the list? And so what we can see here is for our purple line, that's when they were tested immediately. They give you the list, they ask you which ones were on the list. We see our normal U-shaped curve. But if we delay the test by just 30 seconds, so just longer than the duration of our short-term memory, then we see that the recency effect drops off completely. But our primacy effect is still there. So that does tell us that, yeah, there was probably some kind of encoding going on that allowed us to remember the first couple, but there's only so much that we could store in this time span. So yeah, it's probably something to do with short-term memory, or I guess immediate memory. So, okay, so that's lots of remembering, and we focused on what we remember and why we remember it. But what about if we talk about the other way? Why do we forget things? Why do some things not get recalled? And so we have two basic ideas here. The first is that there might have been an encoding failure. So maybe you didn't store the information away in the first place. So if we remember back to our diagram that showed our process of memory, starting at our sensory receptors, sending info to our sensory memory, we could forget things at that stage. If you don't pay attention to something, it would never make it into your immediate memory. You'd never do anything with it, so it would be forgotten right away. Or maybe you had it in your immediate memory, but you didn't do anything with it. You didn't process it in order to encode it, and so you forgot at that stage. So maybe you only encoded stuff that you thought was important, and everything else was just sort of dropped at that point. So that's one option, that things weren't encoded. But I did mention before that we do have this issue where most of the times that we forget things, it's not because of encoding failure, it's actually retrieval failure. It's usually that the information is in there somewhere, we just can't get to it quite yet. So we're going to come back to that a little bit today. And so one of our ideas of why we forget things that should be stored in our memory is this idea of the decay of memory trace. And this kind of goes back to that concept that I was talking about sort of all throughout this chapter, where memories in long-term storage are like things at the end of a path. And the more you travel the path, the more secure that path is, the less likely it is to go away. If you disuse that path, if you don't use it anymore, it'll grow over and then you can't find it again. So this would be the idea that over time, that physical trace, that path to that particular memory would fade away in your nervous system because you haven't been using it. So if you don't use it, you're going to lose it. Now, this kind of makes logical sense, and it's like, yeah, things that happened in the past are a lot less likely to be recalled, maybe. So maybe if you forget the name of the new person at work because you were introduced to them on the first day and then you didn't have another shift with them for 2 weeks. So you'd be less likely to recall their name after all that time because you hadn't sort of been able to rehearse and interact with them and make that path stronger. And even though this is something that sort of logically makes sense, there isn't a ton of evidence for this theory. Yes, there are some things that seem to fade with time, but it's not sort of a consistent decay kind of idea. And some things you might have, I guess, to go against this, there are things that you haven't thought of in years. So maybe there's a song, it comes on the radio, and all of a sudden you get really excited, a wave of nostalgia hits you, and you're like, I haven't heard this since middle school. But you know all of the lyrics. So even though it should have decayed according to this theory, you still know everything about it. So it's not always consistent, and that's why this isn't sort of the most common theory. We can also talk about the interference theory of forgetting. And this basically says that information is forgotten because other items in our long-term memory will get in the way of or impair our ability to retrieve it. And so there's 2 types of interference. So we can have retroactive and proactive interference. And this is another one of those that I always use diagrams to remember because it does not stick in my brain which direction is which. But our first one at the top is retroactive interference. And this says that the new things that we learn will interfere with the recall of old things. And the example that I like to use for this is maybe you're learning languages. So maybe you spoke Spanish when you were younger, you've more recently switched over to learning French because that's apparently useful in Canada. And then because you've more recently learned French, that keeps coming into your mind. So even when you're trying to speak Spanish, which you should be able to, the French is going to interfere with the recall of your Spanish words. So the new information gets in the way of your old information. And then we can have the other direction, proactive interference. That's sort of the arrow going in the other way. And this is when our old memories will interfere with the recall of our new memories. And so we can have the same setup. We had known Spanish, we then learned French, and then the Spanish, the thing that we've known for longer, gets in the way because you're so used to using Spanish that it's harder for you to sort of push aside the Spanish to get the newer French. And these aren't necessarily meant to be mutually exclusive. We don't just use one or the other. And sometimes you'll find that both happen. So especially people who know multiple languages will know that they have trouble sometimes both directions because of pro and retroactive interference, just depending on the day. And so this might be something like, okay, so you met somebody at a party, and they introduce themselves, and then the next day you bump into them and you're like, I swear I know who you are, but I met like 8 people last night and I can't remember which one you specifically are. That would be like the stuff that was learned afterwards interfering with what had happened before. And there's a lot more evidence for this interference theory of forgetting where stuff just gets in the way. But of course, neither of these is going to be a perfect theory and none of it explains everything completely. We're just pointing out some of the things that people generally agree on. Our next topic are the 7 sins of memory. And these are grouped into 2 categories. We're going to look at errors of omission and then errors of commission. So omission is when sort of information doesn't occur, and then commission is when information happens but it's not right or it's not what we want. So for our official definitions, errors of omission are memory errors where information cannot be brought to mind. So you can't recall something. So this might be due to transience. Maybe the memory wasn't permanently stored and it has faded away over time. Kind of like our decay theory, but we're not assuming that it's always constant for everything. We might have absent-mindedness. Maybe the memories aren't available because we never encoded them in the first place. We didn't pay enough attention, or we didn't process them deeply enough. And then the last option is blocking. And this is saying that we stored the information, but we are unable to retrieve it right now because we don't have enough distinctive cues available to help us recover that specific memory. So maybe you and your friend are talking about a movie that you watched and you're trying to remember the main actor's name and it's just not coming to you. So they look it up on their phone and you say, "Don't tell me, I'm going to get it. I need to know it myself." And after a couple minutes, you still don't have it. So you say, "Okay, give me a hint." And they tell you the first letter of their name and you immediately know what it is. That would be overcoming blocking using a cue. So by providing another cue, you can overcome that mental block and retrieve that information. All right, so those are our errors of omission. Now for the errors of commission. This is when wrong or unwanted information is brought to mind. And for these, we're actually going to go into each of them in a little bit more detail, just because, I don't know, in my opinion, they're a lot more interesting. But we're going to look at misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. So the first of these, misattribution, is when you sort of attribute a memory to the wrong situation. Déjà vu is a fantastic example of this. So déjà vu is the feeling that you've already experienced a particular sequence of events. And the term directly translates in French to already seen. So maybe you encounter a situation and you stop. It's uncanny. You swear you've been here before, but you definitely haven't. So that would be déjà vu. And so that would be sort of a misinterpretation of information saying, "This feels familiar, I must have seen it previously." And there's a lot of really interesting potential explanations for this. And they vary between our two visual pathways might be processed at different rates. And maybe our left eye is seeing a little bit faster than the right eye. So we get the feeling of familiarity because we just processed it a fraction of a second sooner. There's also the fact that our lives are very repetitive. So we might be encountering the same basic situation, but on a different day in a slightly different place, but it still feels familiar. There's lots of different possibilities there. Our next error of commission is suggestibility. And again, we've already kind of dabbled in this idea. And this is the misinformation effect, or I guess one example is the misinformation effect. But basically, our memory is very malleable. We can change it even if we don't mean to. And so we see this very, very often when looking at eyewitness accounts. And our misinformation effect is this strange setup where misleading information can alter the subsequent memory of a particular event. So this is if, I guess if you think back to watching any like cop shows and they talk about separating the witnesses so they can question them individually. And logically, that might be so that if somebody is involved, they don't get their story straight. But in practicality, it's because if the witnesses talk to each other, they can actually start biasing their own stories. So if somebody sees something and tells someone else about it, that other person's memory might slightly change to incorporate that added detail. And so the reliability of their statement will decrease as they're influenced by other people. This is one of the big reasons why eyewitness testimonies are very, very unreliable. And we're going to actually expand on that on the next concept, which is the error of commission of bias. And this basically deals with the fact that we make a lot of use of schemas. And we've talked about schemas as kind of like mental shortcuts. So our brains don't want to store every single detail relevant to a situation. Instead, we're going to simplify. Instead of remembering this specific classroom's layout, maybe we just have a generic representation of a classroom, and that's sufficient in most scenarios. And that's because our brain is a highly organized structure. It has lots of different ways of representing information, and we rely on these schemas to kind of save on space. Stereotypes are examples of schemas, and even sort of associations. We have particular things that we think of when we hear certain words. And so we can start incorporating aspects that we relate with that particular word with our memory if it involves the same concept. And so a great way to sort of visualize this is they did a study on automobile accidents. And in this situation, they had individuals, and they've done it a couple of ways. They've shown them images of a car accident. I think more recently, they've also shown them sort of videos of our virtual reality type car accidents. And then they asked questions about the car accidents. And they varied only the language. Everybody saw the same image or the same video, but the researchers would ask them, how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other? How fast were they going when they crashed into each other? And how fast were they going when they smashed into each other? And even if they saw the exact same videos, even if they saw the same damage outcome, these individuals would answer sort of higher for the more aggressive words and lower speeds for the less intensive words to match their memory to the words that they were given. And if we use things like smash in the descriptor or in the question, people were a lot more likely to recall having seen broken glass at the accident scene, even if there was none. So this shows us that memory is very, very malleable. And so we might say that it is a constructive process, but also reconstructive. So each time you think back to it, you can add and incorporate new information. And sometimes your subsequent memories are based on those reconstructions and not on the original memory itself. And I actually have a neat TED Talk that I usually show in class, and I completely forgot to include it this year. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to link it on Moodle so that if you want to watch it, you can. But it goes through a woman who studies eyewitness testimonies and how unreliable they can be. And she was specifically looking at people who were convicted solely on eyewitness testimony and seeing if that was the best way to sort of be putting people behind bars. But this process happens because we start basically piecing together bits of information in ways that make sense. Those are our schemas. They're allowing us to take those mental shortcuts and we fill in the blanks as needed. And these are actually often very inaccurate in most cases. And so a really cool example of this is a study where they showed people an image kind of like this. And they would say, okay, I'm going to show you this image. And then they put it away and they say, okay, draw what you remember having seen. And so people would put together, they'd have, okay, so it was a bear on the stairs. And they'd get images that would look something like this. But fairly consistently, we start seeing the action of schemas. They drew a fairly stereotypical bear. This is a cartoon stuffed bear. They didn't necessarily make it look exactly like the one that was here, so they missed the fact that it was a panda with a bow tie, but it's bear-shaped, it serves the purpose. They also knew that there were stairs, but they didn't know how many, so they just put some stairs. And they tend to do this thing where they actually widen the camera, so they fill in the gaps at the edge of their memory, and they've actually made it look like there was a lot more seen than there really was. The stairs take up a much larger area here. And this kind of expansiveness, this sort of extension of the borders of that image is very, very common in memory errors. So people tend to fill in those gaps, even if they shouldn't, or even if they didn't have information to do so. And the last of our errors of commission is the idea of persistence. And this is one big problem for individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So if people with PTSD have memories that are difficult to suppress, things that pop into the forefront of their mind, and they might even be consciously trying to avoid thinking about those things, but they persist. They flash back before their eyes, and they can't not remember it. Maybe we've experienced a much simpler version of this. Maybe you did something really embarrassing, and every once in a while you just sort of cringe on the inside because your mind won't let you forget that you did something really silly. And that would be persistence, where it keeps popping back even though you really don't want to remember that it happened. Our next concept is actually just sort of a brief little respite from forgetting, and we're going to talk about the opposite. So this is a disorder called hyperthymesia. And so from the ending of it, the mesia part, that kind of reminds us of amnesia, which was the absence of memory of a particular kind. And this is hyper, so over the top memory. So hyperthymesia is a rare medical condition where individuals have almost perfect autobiographical recall. Basically, they can remember everything that's happened to themselves during their lives. And some of them can actually remember a lot further back into their childhood than most people can. But you could ask them, like, what did you do on whatever date 8 years ago? And they could tell you that it was a Tuesday and that the weather was this particular way and they did this thing. So these individuals have fantastic recall, and they seem to be fairly accurate as well, despite the fact that most of us cannot do something even remarkably like this. And in these individuals, their amygdala tends to be a lot larger than normal. So they have this expanded part of the brain, and our amygdala is involved in a lot of emotional processing. So maybe it has something to do with the fact that they're remembering things that happened to themselves. So something about how they were feeling at the time is being encoded, perhaps. They also see a lot more connections between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So these individuals have lots of connections there, and we know that the hippocampus is related to the storage of memories long term and the retrieval of them as well, so that kind of makes sense. But again, they're not positive why this happens, and it does happen sort of every once in a while, so it's very rare, but they have multiple cases to study. For a lot more common things that we see, common kinds of forgetting, we all experience infantile or childhood amnesia. And this is basically the fact that you can't really remember anything prior to the age of 3 or 4. And so maybe your earliest memories of your childhood happened probably when you were 4 or 5 or 6, in that range. But anything before that is pretty much a blur. And this is nearly a universal experience. Pretty much everybody has this same experience. And they're not quite sure why. There's a bunch of possibilities. One is that when we're growing, those parts of our brain that are involved in actually encoding memory, maybe they haven't developed yet. So we can't store memory because we're not capable yet. Or maybe we have a limited depth of encoding. We're not paying attention or processing things extensively enough to store them for later. Again, they're not quite sure. We also fairly commonly see dementia, which is sort of a category of impaired memory and other kinds of cognitive deficits that come along with brain degeneration, and they end up interfering with normal functioning. Now, we can see sort of lesser cases of dementia as we age. So older age dementia is just the natural decline of our cognitive processes as we get older. And we actually have ways to combat that. It's that idea of if you use it, you lose it. If you exercise your brain and expose yourselves to sort of new concepts and new activities, and you think in complex ways, you can actually have a protective effect on the decline of your brain with age. But there are other cases, things like Alzheimer's disease, which then affect sort of at the level of the brain and cause problems whether you've been protected or not. And Alzheimer's disease can lead to severe retrograde and anterograde amnesia. And it kind of makes sense when we look at how the disease spreads. It starts sort of at the middle, deals with the temporal lobes, spreads to our frontal lobes and other areas. So it seems like it would interfere with that part.
So, like, is it still there? Or is it, like, because there's people who, if something so traumatic happens to them, it like, blocks it out in their brain?
It depends. We will talk a little bit about repression. and the thought of like sort of suppressing memories so that you don't remember them. But it might just be that in order to protect yourself, you just don't use those pathways until they degrade. So possibly, but most of this is theory and guess because it's so complex that we really just don't know. But yeah, I don't know. All right. So the last part that I wanted to talk about for this, I guess, chapter entirety is talking about exactly what's going on that's creating these memories. We've kind of tiptoed around that concept. We haven't really mentioned it. So we kind of know some things about biochemistry and some things about neurons and things like that. We're not going to go into a ton of detail here. We don't have time, but there are some things that change at a biochemical level when we form memories. So we start seeing alterations in our synaptic transmission. So our neurons start firing differently as we learn and remember things. So we start seeing hormones that might modulate the expression of neurotransmitters. We also see neurotransmitters that might affect other neurotransmitters. There might even be proteins produced that end up sort of involved in this whole process. So as we learn and make connections, things at the level of the chemicals in our brain can start changing a little bit. We also see changes at the level of our neural circuitry. So we've kind of talked about this, the fact that as neurons tend to fire together, they tend to have stronger associations. So if they're used together more and more and more, they form more connections and are more likely to fire together in the future. So we start seeing these localized neural circuits, these pathways in the brain that form and start firing in unison. So we have this process called neurogenesis where we make new pathways as new concepts are learned. And we start seeing long-term potentiation, which is just the idea that as things are activated, it becomes easier to activate them again in the future. And then if we wanted to talk about ways that we represent concepts, there are two major ways that research tends to be focused. The first is through the concept of associative networks. And this is just the idea that memory can be represented as a network of associated concepts. So this isn't a physical network, this is a theoretical network. And it basically says that each concept is represented by a node, and each node that has a relationship to other concepts is connected by a line. Shorter lines mean stronger relationships. And so we could have right here, we've simplified it. I'm just showing you a single line of three concepts. But when people mostly try and represent these things, they use three-dimensional models, and they get insanely complex very, very quickly. But the idea here is, okay, so if we think of fire trucks deal with fires, and fires are hot. So we can represent all of those things together, and we kind of connect them together. So those are words that if we think of one, kind of make us think of the others. And we can actually relate this to the concept of priming. So we mentioned the fact that if we activate a particular pathway, it's then more likely to be used in the future. So it's kind of like if we activate the area for fire truck, that makes us think of fires. So if we were asked about something that is orange, we might say fire. And then we can have sort of thinking of fires might make us more likely to think of fire trucks than ambulances and things like that. So we'd have sort of a ripple effect of activation through these theoretical networks. But again, these are networks of associations and they're not actual physical structures. They're just how we represent concepts. So it's a very loose representation here. Some people choose to focus instead on neural networks. So it's also describing linked nodes, but here we're talking about nodes as connections between neurons. So now we're looking at the physical map of neurons and how they fire together. So the nodes are physical, they're going to be level of our neurons, and they're going to fire together. So we have that map of neurons, a network of neurons. But we specify here that each node doesn't contain a unit of information. Instead, a concept would be represented by sort of a pattern of firing. So we can't necessarily know what does it look like to think of fire, because it would be too complex. So this is if we wanted to focus more on the structure of what's going on, and we would use the other theory if we were trying to focus on how do the concepts relate. But it's really, really hard to bridge the gap between the two because, again, it's so complex that it's kind of hard to make those connections. So you'll see a little bit of both if you go on in memory research, and they tend to focus on one or the other in terms of models, depending on what works with their research. So not mutually exclusive and not necessarily one or the other. All right, and then if we wanted to very, very briefly do a little bit of a reminder on some of the physiology of memory. So a lot of this is going to be related to what we talked about during our case studies. So we talked about the anatomy and which parts of the brain seem to be involved in which aspects. So we have our cerebral cortex and our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus. And we have that idea that our prefrontal cortex makes those connections between ideas. It can pull things out of our cerebral cortex to process. And when we're sending information in to be encoded, it's going to go through our hippocampus. And maybe the amygdala is involved because it's including things like emotion. So if we're afraid of something or something like that, that would involve the amygdala. And if we're thinking about things that are related to actions and movements, then we're thinking about our cerebellum at the back. That would be our procedural memory. And our procedural memories don't necessarily need the hippocampus. But those are our key areas. And we've already talked about those, so we won't spend time here. And then our last little reminder here is our breaking down of our systems and types of memories. Just a little bit of a refresher here at the end. So we've talked about implicit versus explicit memory, where explicit is the stuff that we can verbalize, that we can talk about. Implicit is the stuff that we can't necessarily verbalize, but we just do. And we've talked mostly about implicit memory being our procedural memory. We can ride a bike, but we can't necessarily tell you how we can ride a bike. We could actually apply that concept to things like priming, where we don't even realize that we're making those connections because it's not something that we can explicitly state. So you might have noticed the term implicit on our slide about priming, and that's just because when we're priming, we can't necessarily verbalize that it's happening because we aren't aware that it's happening. We just are more likely to recall certain concepts because they had been activated fairly recently. So that's something that happens without conscious knowledge. It happens implicitly. We also have our declarative and non-declarative memory. That's how that overlapped again with our implicit versus explicit. Declarative, we can talk about it. Non-declarative, we can't talk about it. Procedural being our non-declarative memory. We had our semantic versus episodic. Episodic meaning episodes of our own lives, things that we experienced ourselves, and semantic just being facts and information. And the last one is one that we've kind of talked about, but not really realized that we were talking about it. This is the idea of prospective and retrospective memory. So retrospective is looking back, reflecting back on our memories. So remembering things that have happened. Pretty much everything that we've been talking about so far is retrospective memory. And so we have prospective memory as kind of like a special situation. And I'm going to spend just, I think, one slide talking about it because it's kind of cool. So prospective memory is this remembering to perform a task in the future. So it's remembering that you need to do something ahead of time, or you need to do something later on. So this involves planning and attention. So this is going to do a lot, or have a lot to do with our frontal lobes because we need our executive processes involved. And this is interesting because people who have really good memory in terms of sort of retrospective, sort of recall memory, they don't necessarily have better prospective memory. So they seem to be two separate systems. And prospective memory seems to decline with age, at least in lab studies. It's kind of hard to study this long term, where as you get older, you tend to be more forgetful. Some of us have always been forgetful and just get really good at finding little tricks that get you around. But yeah, it seems that it's something that you learn to have systems in place and you learn to like routine so that it doesn't become a problem. But that would probably go along with the decline, cognitive decline with age. And then the last slide, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the potential for motivated forgetting. And this is the idea of repression. So this is a very Freudian concept, and it's something that was originally based on Freud's research. Some people think that it's a thing. Some people think it's not a thing. There's a lot of conflicting research. But this is the idea that repression might occur because we're trying to block the recall of anxiety-arousing memories. So if something causes us anxiety, then it's bad. So we should push it aside and intentionally forget it so we don't feel that way. And some people say, well, there might be a conscious process where if you try and forget about something, you can sort of intentionally not think about it until that pathway degrades and you no longer think about it. But sometimes it'll have the opposite effect. Back to the example of remembering something that makes you cringe. You know that it bothers you and it's going to keep popping up. And the more that it pops up, the more you're going to remember it. And the more you remember it, the longer it sticks with you. So conscious repression isn't always the best go-to here. And sometimes it's seen as an unconscious process where individuals who suffer trauma might not be able to recall an event. And some people would say that it's because their mind is protecting themselves, but we really don't understand the process. So a lot of unknowns, hence the question mark there. But yeah, that was what I had for memory today.